June 24, 1944, Iwo Jima Airfield, Bonin Islands. The volcanic ash runway shimmered in the morning heat as Petty Officer First Class Saburō Sakai gripped the control stick of his Mitsubishi A6M Zero with hands that had shot down more enemy aircraft than most pilots would ever see. Through the canopy, he watched the eastern horizon where American carrier planes would soon appear, not in the manageable formations of 1941, but in swarms that darkened the sky like storm clouds. We shot them down every week, but they came by dozens, always by dozens. These words, spoken to a fellow pilot just minutes before takeoff, would echo through history as the epitaph of Japanese naval aviation. Sakai, with 28 confirmed aerial victories to his name, one of Japan's highest-scoring aces, understood what younger pilots around him could not yet grasp. They were witnessing the mathematical certainty of defeat, written not in battle plans but in production statistics that rendered individual heroism meaningless. 600 miles to the east, Task Force 58 launched its morning strike package, 15 fleet carriers disgorging 450 aircraft in synchronized waves. The Americans had lost 89 planes the previous week. This morning they launched 5 times that number without concern. In the ready rooms of the USS Essex, USS Yorktown, and USS Lexington, fresh-faced ensigns with 400 hours of flight training prepared for their first combat missions, knowing that behind them stood an assembly line producing 3 new Hellcats for everyone lost. The arithmetic of annihilation was already written. America would produce 96,318 aircraft in 1944 alone, more than Japan had manufactured in the entire war to date. The journey to this moment of mathematical impossibility had begun 16 years earlier in the humid summer of 1928, when a teenage Saburō Sakai stood before the gates of the Sasebo Naval Base. Born August 25, 1916, in Saga Prefecture as the third of 8 children to an impoverished farming family descended from samurai, Sakai had enlisted in the Imperial Japanese Navy at age 16, seeking escape from rural poverty that offered no future beyond rice fields and debt. The selection process for naval aviation was merciless by design. Of the 1,500 applicants who entered Sakai's class at the Tsuchiura Naval Aviation School in 1937, only 70 would earn their wings. The washout rate exceeded 95%, a deliberate strategy to produce elite pilots rather than adequate ones. Candidates endured physical trials that broke bones and spirits, hanging from iron bars until their hands bled, swimming in January seas until hypothermia set in, practicing aerobatics until they vomited, then practicing more. Sakai graduated 11th in his class on November 27, 1937, with 650 hours of flight time, a number that would seem impossible to American training programs just 5 years later. Posted to the 12th Kokutai Air Group, he first tasted combat over China in 1938 to 1939, flying the Mitsubishi A5M against Chinese pilots in obsolete biplanes. His first kill came on October 5, 1938, near Hankow, a Soviet-built Polikarpov Height 16 that burst into flames after a 2-second burst from his 7.7mm machine guns. By May 1941, when Sakai joined the Tainan Kokutai on Formosa, he had accumulated over 800 flight hours and 4 confirmed victories. The elite Tainan Air Group represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval aviation, containing pilots who would become legends. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who would claim 87 victories before his death. Toshio Ota with 34 kills. Masaki Shimakawa with 27. These men believed themselves inheritors of the samurai tradition, aerial warriors whose skill and spirit would overcome any material disadvantage. The first indication of what they would face came December 8, 1941, December 7th across the international dateline, when Sakai participated in the attack on Clark Field in the Philippines. Flying escort for 54 G4M bombers, the Zeros caught the Americans completely unprepared despite 9 hours warning after Pearl Harbor. Sakai shot down a P-40 Warhawk, watching the American fighter disintegrate under his cannon fire. On the ground below, neat rows of B-17 flying fortresses burned in what Sakai would later describe as resembling a forest fire. What struck Sakai most forcefully wasn't the easy victory, but the sheer number of aircraft destroyed, over 100 American planes eliminated in a single morning. If the Americans could afford to leave so many aircraft exposed after receiving warning of war, what reserves did they possess? The early months of 1942 seemed to validate Japanese confidence in quality over quantity. On February 3rd, flying from the newly captured base at Rabaul, Sakai engaged in combat over Bougainville, demonstrating the Zero's superiority in turning ability against American Wildcats that could not match its maneuverability. During these halcyon days, the kill ratios seemed to justify Japan's training philosophy. At the Battle of the Java Sea on February 27th, Sakai's squadron destroyed multiple Allied aircraft while losing only a handful of Zeros. Over Port Darwin on February 19th, the Tainan Kokutai claimed numerous victories against minimal losses. Individual Japanese pilots were shooting down multiple enemy aircraft per engagement. But beneath these tactical victories, troubling patterns emerged for those willing to see them. After shooting down a B-17 in early 1942, Sakai noted how the bomber had absorbed incredible punishment before finally succumbing. The American bomber's defensive fire had been accurate and sustained throughout, its gunners continuing to shoot even as flames engulfed the fuselage. More disturbing still were the replacement rates. When Allied squadrons lost aircraft, new planes appeared within days. When the Japanese lost fighters, replacements took weeks to arrive from Japan. The mathematics were simple but ignored. The Allies were replacing losses faster than Japan could inflict them. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, the Tainan Kokutai's operations officer, privately calculated that at current loss rates versus American production estimates, Japan would need to achieve a 10-to-1 kill ratio just to maintain parity by 1944. They were achieving 3-to-1 at best. August 7th, 1942, 0530 hours. The scramble alarm at Rabaul's Lakunai airfield sent pilots running to their aircraft. American forces had invaded Guadalcanal and Tulagi, catching the Japanese completely by surprise. Sakai strapped into his Zero, one of 18 fighters assigned to escort 27 G4M bombers on the 560 nautical mile journey to Guadalcanal, the longest fighter mission ever attempted at that time. The flight itself tested human endurance to its limits. For 4 hours, Sakai held formation over the Solomon Sea, managing fuel consumption with surgical precision. The slightest excess in throttle or unnecessary maneuver could mean ditching in shark-infested waters on the return flight. Behind him, rookie pilots who had graduated flight school just weeks earlier struggled to maintain position, their fuel gauges dropping faster than calculated. At 13:15, they arrived over Guadalcanal to find an invasion fleet that defied comprehension. The ocean was covered with warships, Sakai would write in his autobiography, Samurai, published in 1957. I counted over 70 vessels, including what appeared to be 6 aircraft carriers. In reality, there were 82 Allied ships, including 3 fleet carriers, Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp, launching continuous fighter patrols. The ensuing battle would become legendary in aviation history. Sakai shot down a dauntless dive bomber, then engaged in a prolonged duel with Lieutenant James Pug Sutherland's Wildcat from VF5 off the Saratoga. For nearly 20 minutes, the two fighters twisted through the sky in a classical dogfight, each pilot pushing their aircraft to its limits. Sutherland, an experienced aviator with over 500 combat hours, matched Sakai maneuver for maneuver until ammunition exhaustion forced him to disengage. But the day's most significant moment came at 14:50, when Sakai spotted what he believed were 8 Wildcat fighters, flying in loose formation 8,000 feet below. Rolling into a diving attack from their 6 o'clock position, the blind spot, he closed to 50 meters before realizing his fatal error. They weren't fighters, but SBD Dauntless dive bombers with rear gunners. Aviation Machinist's Mate Second Class Harold Lew Jones, gunner in Lieutenant Dudley Adams's Dauntless from VS5, opened fire with his twin 30 caliber Browning machine guns, just as Sakai realized his mistake. The bullets struck with devastating accuracy. One round penetrated Sakai's skull above his right eye, destroying the eye instantly. Another creased his skull, causing partial paralysis on his left side. Blood streamed into his remaining eye, effectively blinding him. What followed was one of aviation history's most remarkable feats of airmanship. Semi-conscious, partially paralyzed, and unable to see clearly, Sakai flew 560 nautical miles back to Rabaul using volcanic smoke plumes as his only navigation reference. For 4 hours and 47 minutes, he drifted in and out of consciousness, several times nearly inverting the aircraft into the ocean. He landed at Rabaul at 1800 with less than 10 litres of fuel remaining. The mission statistics told the real story. Japan lost 23 aircraft and crews. The Americans lost fewer planes and rescued most of their downed pilots. While Japan struggled to replace 24 aircraft, American carriers were already receiving new planes flown directly from factories on the west coast. While Sakai recovered in naval hospitals, a process that would take 8 months, the air war over Guadalcanal ground through the Japanese Naval Air Force like a mechanical thresher. The statistics from those months reveal the inexorable mathematics that would doom Japan's aviation. Between August 1942 and February 1943, the Japanese Navy lost nearly 900 aircraft in the Solomons. Behind each aircraft was a pilot with a minimum of 500 flight hours, many with over 1,000. These men represented years of training investment that Japan could not repeat. The pilot training schools were graduating only 100 pilots monthly, and these with progressively fewer training hours, down to 400 hours by early 1943. The Americans, by contrast, were graduating 2,500 naval aviators monthly from Pensacola alone, with additional thousands from Corpus Christi, Jacksonville, and San Diego. Each American pilot received a minimum of 400 flight hours, including 100 hours in operational aircraft types. When they reached the combat zone, they were integrated into squadrons with experienced pilots who mentored them through their first missions. Commander Minoru Genda, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, visited Guadalcanal in October 1942 and was appalled by what he found. In a report classified Most Secret and delivered personally to Admiral Yamamoto, he wrote, "We are literally wearing away our naval aviation strength in a war of attrition we cannot win. The enemy replaces losses immediately. We cannot replace them at all." The Japanese tried to compensate through tactical innovation. They extended the range of operations from Rabaul by establishing forward bases. They coordinated massive fighter sweeps. They developed new tactics. None of it mattered against the overwhelming numbers. The production differential reflected a stunning industrial mismatch. In 1940, before entering the war, the United States had produced 12,804 military aircraft. Japan, already 3 years into the China War, managed only 4,768. American production was essentially peacetime levels. Japan was already at maximum capacity. Pearl Harbor transformed American industry overnight. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan, which hadn't existed in 1940, was producing one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes by 1944. The single factory's floor space exceeded all Japanese aircraft manufacturing facilities combined. At peak production, 42,000 workers assembled bombers from 1,550,000 parts. North American aviation produced over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs, each superior to the Zero in speed, firepower, armor, and high-altitude performance. Grumman manufactured 12,275 F6F Hellcats in just 30 months, an aircraft specifically designed to counter the Zero. The airplane that would shoot down more Japanese aircraft than any other was produced at a rate exceeding a dozen per day. The disparity extended beyond numbers to technological advancement. While Japan struggled to maintain production of the increasingly obsolete Zero, America introduced entirely new aircraft types quarterly. The F4U Corsair could outrun the Zero by 80 miles per hour. The P-38 Lightning, with twin engines and devastating firepower, could attack from altitudes where the Zero's engine struggled. By mid-1943, American aircraft engines were producing 2,000 horsepower compared to the Zero's 1,130. American fighters carried armor plating. The Zero had none. American planes used high-octane fuel that provided significantly more power than Japan's aviation gasoline. Sakai returned to limited duty in June 1943, his right eye permanently destroyed, his depth perception compromised. Posted to Toyohashi Air Base as an instructor, he witnessed firsthand the collapse of Japanese pilot training standards. The new students arriving from primary training had 150 flight hours, less than American pilots received before they even touched a combat aircraft. "We were supposed to make fighter pilots out of these children in 3 months," Sakai recalled in a 1985 interview. "They could barely land without crashing. We were sending them to die, nothing more." The training aircraft themselves revealed the resource crisis. The advanced trainers were worn out A5Ms from the China War, patched and repatched until they barely flew. Fuel allocations permitted each student only 60 hours of flight time in the operational training phase. There were no spare parts. When trainers were damaged, they were cannibalized to keep others flying. The instructor cadre consisted largely of wounded veterans like Sakai, men who should have been invalided out but whom Japan could not afford to lose. These damaged men tried to pass on their knowledge to boys who would never live long enough to use it. The statistics from late 1943 training classes tell the story. Of graduates sent to combat zones, the majority were dead within 6 months. Despite his injuries, Sakai volunteered to return to combat in June 1944. The American invasion of the Marianas threatened to bring B-29 bombers within range of the Japanese homeland. Every available pilot was needed, including half-blind veterans who belonged in hospitals. Sakai was assigned to Yokosuka Kokutai and deployed to Iwo Jima on June 24, 1944, arriving in the midst of what Americans would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In a single day, June 19th, Japanese naval aviation had lost 315 aircraft and 445 aircrew. The Americans lost 29 planes and recovered most of their pilots. On his first combat mission from Iwo Jima, June 24th, Sakai encountered the new reality of American air power. Leading a section of 4 Zeros on an interception mission, he found not the manageable formations of 1942, but an incoming strike of over 200 aircraft, Hellcats, Avengers, and Dauntlesses in perfectly coordinated waves. "The sky was black with them," he told historian Henry Sakida in 1994. "They came in layers, fighters on top, dive bombers in the middle, torpedo planes below. For every one we engaged, 5 more appeared." In the ensuing combat, Sakai found himself alone against 15 F6F Hellcats. Using every trick learned in years of flying, he survived a 20-minute engagement that would have killed any pilot with less experience. He used clouds for cover, executed snap rolls at the edge of structural failure, and once escaped by diving so close to the ocean that spray covered his canopy. He claimed one Hellcat possibly damaged, but knew it meant nothing. The Americans could afford to lose dozens. The mathematics of the battle were stark. Japan deployed 450 aircraft to the Marianas battle and lost 480, including reinforcements, in 3 days. Task Force 58 launched nearly 1,000 sorties on June 19th alone, losing only 29 aircraft while destroying two-thirds of Japanese naval aviation in a single afternoon. By October 1944, when Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi formally organized the Special Attack Units, kamikaze, at Mabalacat in the Philippines, the decision reflected not fanaticism, but mathematical inevitability. Sakai understood the brutal logic with clarity. In a 1998 interview, Sakai explained, "You must understand, we had boys with 30 hours of flight time going up against Americans with 300 hours. They couldn't even find the enemy, much less shoot them down. If they flew normally, they died achieving nothing. If they flew kamikaze, they might at least damage a ship. It was simple arithmetic." The training pipeline had completely collapsed. The Yokorin, Naval Aviator Preparatory Course, was pushing through students in 90 days with less than 100 flight hours total. Many had never fired their guns in flight. Ammunition was too precious for gunnery practice. They couldn't navigate beyond visual range of land. They certainly couldn't dogfight. The American response was overwhelming. Task Force 38 could deploy 1,200 aircraft from 17 fleet carriers plus 8 light carriers. These were replaced continuously. When air groups suffered casualties, they were rotated stateside and replaced with fresh squadrons. Japanese units fought until annihilated. Sakai's final combat missions came during the defense of the homeland in 1945. Now flying from Yokosuka Naval Air Station near Tokyo, he participated in interception missions against B-29 raids and later against carrier strikes. What he witnessed defied description. During Operation 10 Go, the defense of Okinawa in April 1945, Japan launched massive kamikaze attacks against the American invasion fleet. The American fleet had perfected its defense by this point. Radar-directed 5-inch guns opened fire at 10,000 yards. 40mm Bofors guns engaged at 4,000 yards. 20mm Oerlikons created a final barrier at 2,000 yards. The new proximity-fused shells exploded automatically near aircraft. Combat air patrols of 50 or more Hellcats orbited at varying altitudes, vectored by radar to intercept incoming raids 50 miles from the fleet. "We would start with 100 aircraft," Sakai recalled. "By the time we reached the American fleet, perhaps 20 were left. Of those, maybe 1 or 2 would actually hit a ship, usually a destroyer on radar picket duty. The Americans had so many ships that losing a destroyer meant nothing to them." The statistics from Okinawa are staggering. Japan launched 1,465 kamikaze sorties and lost over 1,000 aircraft in conventional attacks. They sank 36 American ships and damaged 368, but Task Force 58 remained fully operational throughout, launching 40,000 combat sorties. For every American ship sunk, Japan lost 60 aircraft and pilots. Sakai's last combat mission occurred in early August 1945, just days before Japan's surrender. Leading a flight of Zeros from Yokosuka, he was ordered to intercept B-32 Dominator bombers photographing Tokyo. It was a mission that encapsulated the war's futility. Obsolete fighters against the newest American bomber, itself a backup design because America could afford redundancy in everything. The interception failed. The B-32s flew too high and too fast for the Zeros to catch. Sakai could only watch as they photographed Japanese cities already reduced to ash. The war was already over. The missions were merely documenting the devastation. The production statistics tell the complete story of Japan's defeat in the air. Total war production United States, 295,959 aircraft, including 99,465 fighters. Japan, 76,320 aircraft, including 30,447 fighters. The United States produced more aircraft in 1944 alone, 96,318, than Japan manufactured during the entire war. American fighter production alone exceeded total Japanese aircraft production of all types, but the numbers tell only part of the story. American aircraft in 1945 were technological generations ahead of their 1941 predecessors. The P-51 Mustang could fly at 437 miles per hour compared to the Zero's 331 miles per hour. The F4U Corsair had a climb rate of 4,500 feet per minute versus the Zero's 3,100. Japanese aircraft showed minimal advancement. The A6M Zero that Sakai flew in 1944 was barely different from the A6M2 of 1941. Slightly faster, but still unarmoured, still using the same cannons, still limited by the same underpowered engine. Behind every aircraft was a pilot, and here too the mathematics overwhelmed Japan. The United States trained 193,440 pilots during World War II, including 60,956 naval aviators. Japan trained approximately 15,000 naval aviators and 25,000 Army pilots total. American pilot training maintained consistent standards throughout the war, 400-plus hours before combat. Japanese training hours collapsed progressively, from 700 to 800 hours in 1941 to 50 to 100 hours by 1942-1945. By war's end, American replacement pilots arrived with more flight time than many Japanese instructors. Other Japanese aces corroborated Sakai's observations about American numerical superiority. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, Japan's leading ace with 87 claimed victories, told Sakai during his last leave in October 1944. "It's not like before, Saburo. In 1942, I could fly alone and attack a whole squadron. Now they come in groups of 50, 100, 200. There's no room to maneuver, no space to escape. We are drowned in numbers." Nishizawa was killed October 26, 1944, not in combat, but as a passenger in a transport plane shot down by Hellcats. His death epitomized the late-war reality. Japan's greatest ace died unable even to defend himself. Commander Masatake Okumiya provided the most analytical assessment in his post-war book Zero, written with Jiro Horikoshi. "We thought spirit could overcome material disadvantage. We believed one Japanese pilot was worth 3 Americans. Perhaps this was true in 1941. By 1943, the Americans had better planes. By 1944, they had better pilots. By 1945, they had such overwhelming numbers that individual quality became irrelevant." Tetsuzo Iwamoto, one of the few top aces to survive, reflected, "I shot down a Hellcat in the morning. That afternoon, 3 more appeared. I shot one of those down. The next morning, 10 appeared. How do you fight that? You don't. You simply survive as long as you can." One incident from Sakai's combat career illustrated the human dimension often lost in production statistics. On February 9, 1942, while strafing an airfield in Java, Sakai dove on what appeared to be a military transport. As he closed to firing range, he noticed women and children visible through the aircraft's windows, Dutch civilians evacuating the collapsing Netherlands East Indies. "I couldn't fire," Sakai recalled. "These were not combatants. They were mothers and children fleeing war. I pulled up and waggled my wings, telling them to go." The Dutch pilot, recognizing the gesture, waved back. Sakai's wingmen, following his lead, also held their fire. The transport escaped to Australia carrying civilians who would have certainly died. This act of mercy revealed the complex humanity within the killing machine. 40 years later, at an aviation reunion in the United States, a Dutch woman approached Sakai with tears in her eyes. She had been a child on that transport. Her survival, and that of her children and grandchildren, stemmed from a split-second decision by a Japanese pilot to see humans rather than targets. In his later years, Sakai became increasingly critical of the mythology surrounding Japanese warriors and kamikaze pilots. Speaking at American military academies and aviation museums, he systematically demolished romantic notions about dying for the emperor. You want to know what kamikaze pilots thought about while diving at your ships? He asked a Naval Academy audience in 1991. Not about the Emperor, not about honor. They thought about their mothers. They cried for their mothers. I know because I heard their last transmissions. Oka-san, Oka-san, mother, mother. They were boys, frightened boys, not fanatics. He addressed the Bushido Code with equal bluntness. Bushido was propaganda for making young men willing to die. The samurai of old fought when they had advantage and retreated when they didn't. They weren't stupid. We were stupid. We fought against mathematics itself and wondered why we lost. His most controversial statement came in a joint appearance with Paul Tibbets, pilot of the Enola Gay. If Japan had developed the atomic bomb first, and I had been ordered to drop it on Los Angeles, I would have done so without hesitation. That's war. America was simply better at war than we were. In a 1998 interview, Sakai revealed his anger at Japanese leadership. People ask why we kept fighting when we knew we couldn't win. The ordinary pilots, the young boys dying in their planes, they believed the propaganda. They thought we were winning until the very end. Only senior officers knew the truth, and they chose honor through death over the shame of surrender. The militarists who started the war, they knew America's strength. They had been to America. They saw the factories, the resources, the technology. But they believed Japanese spirit could overcome material disadvantage. They sent us to die for their delusions. Regarding his claimed victories, Sakai was honest about the discrepancy between official records and published claims. When American audiences believed he had 64 victories, a number invented by his ghostwriter Martin Kaiden, Sakai corrected them. The official record shows 28 aerial victories, including shared ones. In war, everyone exaggerates. What matters is not the number, but that we survived to tell the truth about war. The post-war period brought unexpected reconciliation between former enemies. In May 1982, historian Henry Sakida arranged a meeting between Sakai and Harold Lew Jones, the gunner who had destroyed Sakai's eye and nearly killed him at Guadalcanal. The meeting at the Nimitz Museum could have been awkward or hostile. Instead, it became a moment of profound human connection. Sakai brought his flying helmet, still bearing the holes from Jones's bullets and stained with 40-year-old blood. Jones held it with trembling hands, understanding for the first time the human cost of his accurate gunnery. "I was just doing my job," Jones said quietly. "I never thought about the man in the plane." "You were doing your duty," Sakai replied. "As was I. We were both young men serving our countries. There is no hatred, only respect." They became friends, corresponding regularly until Jones's death in 2009. Sakai gave Jones the blood-stained helmet as a gift, saying it belonged with the man whose skill had ended his career as a fighter pilot. What Sakai came to understand and tried to explain to Japanese audiences after the war was that American victory came not from courage or skill, qualities both sides possessed, but from systematic superiority in organization, production, and training. The American pilot training system exemplified this approach. By 1943, the US Navy had established a production line system for creating pilots that maintained quality while achieving quantity. This 60-week program produced pilots with 400 flight hours minimum, while Japan's collapsing system was pushing out pilots with less than 100 hours by 1945. Sakai's famous observation about American planes coming by dozens reflected precise mathematical reality. During major operations, American task forces could surge aircraft in overwhelming waves. Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 19, 1944. Japanese launched 373 aircraft in 4 waves. Americans launched 956 sorties from 15 carriers. Result: 315 Japanese aircraft lost, 29 American. The Americans achieved what military theorists call numerical overmatch. superiority so overwhelming that tactical excellence becomes irrelevant. When every Japanese pilot faced 5, 10, or 15 opponents, individual skill meant nothing. Sakai spent his final decades building bridges between former enemies. He sent his daughter to study at an American university, telling her, "Learn English, learn democracy, learn why they won." She later married an American army officer, symbolically uniting the former enemies. At air shows and military reunions, Sakai signed autographs alongside American aces, often comparing notes about specific dogfights. Veterans who had tried to kill each other 45 years earlier laughed together like old flying buddies. His message to young Japanese was consistent. We lost because we believed our own propaganda. We thought spirit could overcome material reality. America won because they counted correctly. How many planes needed, how many pilots required, how much fuel consumed. They did mathematics, we did mythology. To American audiences, he offered a different lesson. You won through production, but production came from freedom. Free workers in free factories outproduced slave labor and regimented workshops. Your strength wasn't just your numbers, but the system that created those numbers. The final accounting of the Pacific Air War reveals the mathematical impossibility Japan faced. Aircraft carriers produced during war. United States, 28 fleet carriers, 71 escort carriers. Japan, 6 fleet carriers, 4 escort carriers. Pilot training output. United States, 60,956 naval aviators. Japan, approximately 15,000 naval aviators. Aviation fuel production, 1944. United States, 6.5 billion gallons. Japan, 315 million gallons. Every metric told the same story. America could lose 10 planes for every Japanese plane and still dominate through sheer numbers. They actually achieved the reverse, shooting down multiple Japanese aircraft for every American loss, making the conclusion foregone. On September 22, 2000, Saburō Sakai attended a formal dinner at the Atsugi Naval Air Station Officers Club, invited as an honored guest by the US Navy. At age 84, still sharp and dignified, he sat between American naval officers, sharing stories of aerial combat and post-war reconciliation. During dinner, he spoke about the transformation from warrior to peacemaker. "I spent my youth trying to kill Americans. I've spent my old age befriending them. The second task has been more rewarding than the first." As the evening concluded, a young American naval aviator, Lieutenant Commander William Johnson, stood to shake Sakai's hand and thank him for attending. Sakai rose, reached across the table, and suddenly stiffened. The handshake was completed, but Sakai collapsed backward, suffering a massive heart attack. He died in the ambulance racing to the naval hospital, his last conscious act reaching out to an American naval officer in friendship. The symbolism was lost on no one. The samurai who had tried so hard to kill Americans died extending his hand to one in peace. Saburō Sakai's observation that American planes came by dozens, despite Japanese pilots shooting them down every week, captures the fundamental truth of industrial warfare. Individual heroism, tactical brilliance, and warrior spirit meant nothing against overwhelming material superiority systematically applied. The numbers tell the story. America produced 3.87 times more aircraft than Japan, trained 4.83 times more pilots, produced 20.6 times more aviation fuel, built 9.9 times more aircraft carriers, and still achieved a positive kill ratio despite numerical superiority. But Sakai's greater wisdom came from understanding why these numbers existed. In his final interview, 3 months before his death, he said, "America won because it was a free society mobilized for total war. Free workers chose to build planes faster than enslaved laborers in our factories. Free scientists developed better technology than our regimented researchers. Free pilots fought more creatively than our indoctrinated warriors. The dozens of planes that replaced our victories weren't just aluminum and steel, They were products of freedom itself. He paused, then added, "We thought we were fighting for our emperor god. They knew they were fighting for their way of life. That's why they could produce those dozens of planes, train those hundreds of pilots, sustain those thousands of missions. They were defending something worth defending." The final lesson from Saburō Sakai isn't about numbers, but about the systems that create them. Japan's military aristocracy believed in quality through spiritual selection, a few superior warriors defeating many inferior enemies. America believed in quantity through systematic production, overwhelming force scientifically applied. The samurai faced the assembly line, and the assembly line won. Not because Americans were braver or more skilled. Sakai proved throughout his career that Japanese pilots could match anyone in courage and ability. The assembly line won because it could replace losses faster than the samurai could inflict them, learn from mistakes faster than the enemy could exploit them, and adapt to change faster than tradition-bound opponents could respond. When Sakai said, "We shot them down every week, but they came by dozens," he was describing more than aerial combat. He was witnessing the death of the warrior aristocracy and the birth of industrial warfare, where victory went not to the best, but to the most. In that terrible mathematics, Japan never had a chance, and Saburō Sakai, warrior, survivor, and ultimately peacemaker, became the living witness to that transformation. His life journey from shooting down American planes to shaking hands with American pilots encapsulates the greater transformation of Japan itself, from militaristic empire to democratic ally, from warrior state to economic powerhouse, from isolation to integration. The dozens of American planes that overwhelmed him in war became the foundation for understanding that led to peace. That handshake at Atsugi, completed as his life ended, sealed a reconciliation written in the sky over the Pacific by young men who fought with everything they had, only to discover that everything wasn't enough when faced with the inexorable mathematics of American production. The dozens always came, and in the end, the dozens always won.